him and his departments have just published the regional outlook on the MENA region, which obviously looks in great details at the effects which the economic crisis linked to the pandemic is having on the region. There are lots of interesting issues to talk about. Obviously, what's happening in the oil sector will be a large part of the presentation, but more generally, I'm very interested in the risk of new sovereign debt crisis which may occur in the region, and what that means not just for the government, but also for the private sector and companies, given that we have a number of also European companies which are extensively working in the region. So what I suggest is that we start with a presentation from the speaker for about 10 minutes, and then I will ask him questions for another 20 minutes or so, maybe 25, and then we'll leave sometimes for questions from the audience. We have a, I think you're all familiar by now on how to use Zoom to ask questions. Please do that. I will read your questions and then repeat them to our speaker, and we'll try to wrap up by 3:45 or 4 p.m. At the latest. But I will stop my introduction here, and I will ask Mr. Azour to give a short presentation of the report and of the outlook which he sees for the region.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you, although we're meeting remotely. Let me try to be brief, although it's very difficult to be with this current crisis that we are going through. This year is an exceptional year. It's a crisis like no other that the region has witnessed. I would say even if we go back 100 years ago, with the end of the First World War, we did not see such successive shocks happening in the same period. Let me very quickly go back to what has happened over the last year or so. Where do we stand, and what are the prospects for next year, and more importantly, what are the challenges and the risks? In the beginning of the year, we were planning a slow recovery of the oil exporting countries in the region, and we're expecting for the oil importing countries in MENA to have a level of growth that is in the range between 3.5% to 4% of GDP, which is relatively, I would say, in line with other emerging economies, but still 1 to 1.5% lower than what the region needs in order to address the unemployment issue. And then we had the COVID-19 crisis, and one of the first epicenter of the crisis was in the region and started in Iran. And therefore, very quickly, the region has to deal with a pandemic that was not expected, and especially was challenging because of the diversity in healthcare situation in different countries. And then very quickly, a second shock occurred, which is the volatility in oil price. In April, we saw prices going down to levels we have not seen in 20 years, with the oil price at the low 20s, in real term, price level that we did not see since 1973. We were in a situation with a drop in global demand where we had a surplus in oil that exceeded 20 million barrels a day, which is also something that we did not see in the last 4 or 5 decades. Therefore, 2 big shocks affected the region, plus with the shutdown of the global financial markets, countries who have high level of debt also face the risk of capital outflow. What countries have done in order to address this crisis? I would say that countries in the region react with strong and stringent measures to protect lives. They have introduced social distancing measures as well as also other type of confinement measures that help limit the spreading of the virus and reduce the level of fatalities. And when we compare them to other parts of the world, including more advanced economies, we see that they were able to maintain the pandemic spreading under control, and more importantly, to reduce the level of fatalities. But this came at a high cost. The cost was that the economy had to slow down, and also a certain number of activities have to be affected, especially in the region where the work remotely is less advanced than other parts of the world. To address the issue of protecting lives and livelihoods, also government introduced a certain number of fiscal and monetary measures. Fiscal measures were mainly around providing support to low-income people, protecting livelihoods in terms of additional social spending on one hand, and protection of income on the other hand. And this was mainly what countries have introduced, with the varieties between oil exporting countries where the level of health infrastructure is already well advanced, and therefore most important part of their support was in income protection. But when we compare to other parts of the world, the level of stimulus was 2 percentage points of GDP, I would say on the low side compared to other developing economies and emerging economies. And this is mainly due to the fact that fiscal space was limited. In addition to that, some measures were introduced, and thanks to the well-capitalized, well-run banks in the region, central banks were able to inject liquidity and provide some support to the private sector, mainly by providing financial lifelines and delaying some of the payments to small and medium-sized companies. Those measures helped cushion and provide a floor to the economy, but they were not able to limit the drop in economic activities that we saw. That was, along what we saw globally, a negative growth for most of the countries, with the exception of Egypt in the region. But the picture is different between oil importing and oil exporting countries. The drop in oil price and the reduction in oil production because of the extension of the OPEC Plus agreement has led to a sharper drop in economic activity for the oil exporting countries, where we expect this year that they will have a loss in revenues by more than $225 billion compared to last year. And the risk of this could extend in the next years because the recovery in oil price will be slower, and therefore the impact on their export of oil also will remain for the next 2 to 3 years, whereby we expect that between now and 2023, they will lose $500 billion in terms of revenues. For the oil importing countries, the level of drop in economic activity was milder, and we project that the economies of MENA oil importers will be negative by 1.5%. But here there is a diversity in terms of each country's outcome. You have countries like Lebanon, where growth will be minus 25%, and others where growth will be slightly above zero, which is the case in Egypt with a growth of 3.5%. What's next? I think we are currently at the end of the first cycle of dealing with the crisis, where countries started already a few months ago to reopen the economy. And the challenges today is the uncertainties. And the first uncertainty is about the pandemic. Are we going to see a second wave? And how strong this wave will be? Have we learned the lessons of the first one in order to address some of the challenges, especially in the provision of healthcare? What would be the impact of slowdown in global economy on oil and oil price? And are the oil exporting countries going to extend and respect the OPEC Plus agreement in terms of limiting their production? What will be the impact of the results of the US election on the region and the challenges on the geopolitical tensions? On the positive side, countries who have already introduced measures are seeing that the utilization of those instruments was useful. And also they saw some silver linings. Technology played an important role during this crisis. For example, in countries like Morocco, we saw that technology helped, for example, provide through mobile phones support, especially to the informal sector, where more than 5 million people or I would say households were able to get access to support. We saw also technology being used in order to provide telemedicine and improve the capacity to do tracing and control the spreading of the pandemic. We saw also that social solidarity worked very well in many countries, and despite the challenges that we have in the region in terms of vulnerabilities, countries were able to protect lives and livelihoods of their citizens. What is coming next? In addition to this level of uncertainty that is high, there are a certain number of issues that surfaced. Informality is one that proved that this is an issue need to be addressed. Otherwise, social protection and growth and job creation will be limited. Second, access to opportunities, especially for groups that are or are at risk of exclusion, youth and women. Three, technology, it's proved to be critical in providing access to learning remotely, but also access to work, because working remotely also was challenging in some of the countries. Last but not the least, how to prepare the recovery is going to be a critical piece on how fast these countries can retrieve the level of growth pre-COVID-19, especially that the level of scars in certain sectors, like, for example, tourism, export-related industries, could last for more than 1 year. And therefore, the challenge is how to reactivate fast the economy to regain levels of growth that we saw before the crisis that would allow to address two important challenges. One, the high level of debt that is still in overhang, and I would say even deteriorated with this crisis, because we are going to see increasing debt next year. And second is how to create jobs, especially in a region where the level of youth unemployment is high, and in most of the countries exceed 25% of the population. Therefore, this is where the region stands. We expect next year the recovery to be good, but not strong. We will not regain the level of growth that we have pre-COVID, especially for the oil exporting countries. We urge countries to maintain the measures that they have introduced as far as we still in an uncertain moments. And also we urge countries who have still some fiscal space to use it, and others who don't have, to do some re-engineering of their expenditures, to reallocate spending to give priority to social. Going forward, the three priorities are accelerate the recovery, use this crisis as a transformative moment to address the structural problems, and focus on the accelerators, because this crisis was about disruption and acceleration. And acceleration is going to be around technology, greening the economy, different way of organizing work, and also different role of the state. That has to be more important, but maybe different in the way the states needs to operate. And there are plenty of other issues that we have in our outlook this year, the impact of the crisis on the financial sector, as well as also the risks of scarring of some of the activities, like, for example, impact on remittances. This is one of the lifelines of many countries in the region, impact on some of the job-rich sectors like tourism and others. We will have the opportunity during this webinar to go over them. And now I maybe return the floor to you and happy to answer any question.
Absolutely. I mean, thank you very much for your summary, and I urge everyone to have a look at the full report, which is, as often with the IMF material, extremely insightful and very, very interesting. So my first question to you is about really fiscal policy, because the general theme of this year's IMF reports is the use to the kind of urge to, the decision to urge countries generally to make use of their fiscal space to stimulate the economy, and lots of countries are doing it. Now, I'm wondering, whether you think most countries in the region actually do have this fiscal space, or whether you see some limits in the form of either what's going to happen to the currency or what's going to happen in terms of bond market sentiment. So, because obviously, so long as investors are happy to keep borrowing, to keep lending to governments, there is clearly no need to be careful about fiscal policy, especially so long as inflation stays low. But obviously, in these countries, bond market sentiment has often been a constraining factor. So, I'm just curious about your views on this risk.
Well, thank you very much. You have asked more than one question. The first one is on fiscal. I think this region is known for its heterogeneity because you have countries with a high level of buffers, oil exporting countries, and you have countries with high level of debts, and you have high income, middle income, and low income countries. Therefore, I think in terms of fiscal, still the priority is to provide whatever is needed in order to protect lives. And therefore, even countries who don't have fiscal space, making sure that they have enough resources in their budget for additional health spending is a priority. And why it's a priority? It's priority because we have a diversity in healthcare system in the region. And also we have high level of vulnerabilities. Low-income people are vulnerable to the shock. Groups that do not have access to social services, also like refugees, like internally displaced, but also some of those who are in the informal sector. Therefore, this is a priority that should prevail, even if you don't have resources, and then even if you need to maybe delay some of other spending, including some of the capital spending. Second is fiscal is very important, but fiscal has to be used in a very wise and pragmatic way. Measures have to be temporary and have to be targeted, because this is one of the key issues we are facing today. Is deploying some of those measures would need some time to make sure that are well focused. And I think we have learned from the first phase of the crisis where focus should be. In many countries where you have a weak social protection system, it's more on the expenditure side. There are countries like, for example, the Gulf countries where you have already a good level of social protection, especially for the nationals, is more on the revenue side. But I think also some of the quasi-fiscal measures are extremely important. Protect the livelihood requires that you keep access to finance functioning, especially for small and medium-sized companies. And this is an issue for most of the countries of the region because access to finance is low. It's now at a rate of 6% of GDP, where in other emerging markets in the world, it exceeds 15 to 16%. Therefore, this is a priority. The second priority is to address the gaps that exist in working remotely. Working remotely is and will be a challenge if it's not addressed. And this requires some investment in technology and in internet infrastructure, as well as also in the way of working. And here, if there are needs to upgrade that, government should give priority to this area too. But I would say also there is another important fiscal measure, which is a fiscal measure that have a trickling down impact. Why? Is because of the linkages that exist between oil exporting countries and oil importing countries through remittances. And this is an important lifeline for citizens in different countries, including, and I would say more importantly, in low-income countries, like Sudan, like Yemen and others, where this could constitute more than 15% of GDP. Only to give a matter of comparison, the two biggest providers of remittance worldwide are Europe and GCC, 16%, 16%. And those are very important two economic areas for many of the countries in the region. Maghreb countries and some of the Mashriq countries are dependent on Europe and also on the GCC, and the others are definitely dependent on the GCC. Therefore, I think it's very important to have this in mind. but also you need to anchor this in the medium term. Otherwise, the market, and brings me to your second question, the markets will feel that although interest rates are low and liquidity is extremely available, they would sanction countries by not providing them access to finance. And this is why it's very important to anchor any policy into a medium term. Use this as a transformative crisis that will allow countries to address some of their structural problems. In terms of access to markets, countries of the region are among the most active since April, since the eruption of the COVID-19. 40% of the global borrowing into the international capital markets for the sovereign are done from the region. It's definitely GCC, but also others. Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan are very active, and they were able to regain access to market with, I would say, fairly good level of liquidity. Most of their issuance were oversubscribed, but also a relatively good level of financing cost. This does not mean that this opening will remain forever, and it's why it's very important to deepen local markets on one hand, but also to address some of the fiscal challenges. And addressing the fiscal challenges also would require new strategy on the social, but also new tax strategy to broaden the tax base, reduce the level of inequalities by having more progressive tax system. Therefore, I think we are at a time where the region is definitely at a crossroad. If I compare to previous crises, it's a crisis like no other, and therefore I think it's very important for countries to act fast and not to wait too long, as we saw in the past, in addressing some of those shocks that the region is facing currently.
You've spoken about, I mean, the kind of medium-term perspective, and I know it's incredibly hard to be talking about the medium run, where one is, governments are firefighting, what are daily crises, both in the healthcare sector and more generally in the economy. But I'm interested in your view on, the oil market over the medium term. Obviously, what we saw this year in the spring was pretty exceptional. We still remember some oil contracts turning negative, and shock that caused across the world. Now, oil prices have stabilized, but they're still at very low levels. And at the same time, while we are obviously concentrating on the pandemic, there are other changes which obviously could affect fossil fuels more generally. For example, the emphasis in a number of developed countries, I'm thinking, for example, across the European Union, on projects which look at renewable energies and promoting investment in the renewable energy sector. This is a key pillar of the next generation EU fund for the recovery. And also central banks are shifting their thinking. We know the ECB is taking a very close look at how to deal with climate change as part of its monetary policy operations. So we know that obviously, this is something which in the region has been, considered for a while, but it seems to me that 2020 is a big wake-up call in terms of, for oil-dependent economies. So my question to you is, has your outlook for the oil market changed at all as a result of this year? Is this year accelerating some trends? And what is the fund's recommendation for oil-dependent economies?
Well, thank you, Fernandino. I think this is an important question. Let me take one step back. I think this crisis is about disruption and accelerations. Disruption of certain number of sectors and activities in the region and globally, and accelerations of some of the trends. And clearly, as you rightly mentioned, one of the sectors that will accelerate is everything that has to do with greening the recovery, making sure that any investment of the future will promote a more sustainability going forward. And I think this is also a priority for the region that needs to think about its sustainability in terms of utilization of natural resources. How this translates into the impact on the oil. I think we need to differentiate between the short term and the long term. In the short term, markets will be very much dependent on a certain number of factors, the evolution in demand, and are we at the verge of a second round of the pandemic, where the supply will come from, and what is the cost of alternative energies that exist. Are we going to see new output coming to the region? We're seeing, for example, Libya scaling up to 1 million barrels. Are we going to see the same in other parts of the world? Therefore, the supply-demand factors, technology-related issues, the cost of financing of producers, and the capacity for the players in the OPEC Plus agreement to respect what they have agreed on will very much determine where the oil price is going to be in the short term. Projections currently are showing that oil price will be in the corridor of 40 to 45 in the next 2 to 3 years, which is still 25% lower than the price of oil that we had in the beginning of the year. Therefore, in the short term, we will not see a fast recovery or a recovery in the oil price that will bring us to the normal or the prices that we had before. In the medium to long term, we have, in the beginning of the year, issued a study on the long-term sustainability of the oil-producing countries, especially in the GCC, that shows that the long cycle is a cycle where demand will start gradually declining in the medium term, somewhere between 15 to 25 years, 30 years max, with some shift in terms of the supply. But I think this is a trend that we are going to have. What this means for oil exporting countries, it means a certain number of things. One is to accelerate their transformation, both at two levels: transformation in terms of economic activities, and also transformation in terms of revenues of the state. And those are things that they have started, and I think they need to accelerate. Of course, this crisis has affected some of their strategies that were used, which is focusing on service industries because of the impact of the COVID on some of the services like tourism, like real estate, etc. But it's still, the strategy of diversifying went into the wrong direction, and it's still the priority. Diversifying revenues is also another priority that also countries have started. We see VAT being established and now expanding to other countries in the GCC. We see reforms of the subsidies, especially on the energy side, and so on and so forth. And we see countries using those instruments in order to accelerate their diversification. Saudi, for example, as a response to the crisis, increased the VAT rate from 5 to 15%. Other countries are contemplating other type of measures. Therefore, diversifying economy and revenues is important. Also, accelerating the transformation. Access to opportunity is key. You are in a region that 65% of the population is below 30. In the GCC, for example, the level of infrastructure in technology is excellent. They have invested a lot in 5G. Technology has proved to be very useful in managing the COVID-19. They were among the best in class globally in terms of containment measures, in terms of tracing, in terms of telemedicine, etc. And therefore, keeping the focus on technology and allow startups and SMEs to flourish, this is going to be important. And it's an area where Europe and the region can partner. But also reform the labor market. Reforming the labor market is going to be critical to give more flexibility, to give predictability, and provide a social protection system that allows for better mobility and scaling up the resources. And scaling up is going to be very important because you need to address sectors that are facing scarring. And the best way is to train labors and help them to convert from one sector to another.
Just a final question before we open it to questions. Just a reminder to everyone, the Q&A function is at the bottom of the screen. I only see one question for now. Please don't be shy. I'm sure there are more you have. My final question is just on another trend which I'm worried about. We'll see after the pandemic, which is protectionism, and by countries that I'm thinking about Europe and the US. Now, of course, we have a crucial election coming up next week. But more generally, do you see a risk that there will be fewer investment coming into the region over the medium term, or that actually companies will want to relocate some of the production that moved in the region over the past few months because they bow to political pressure from governments, which may require that they bring investment closer to home. So do you see post-pandemic protectionism as a big threat to the region?
Well, I think it's still too early to have a clear answer on that, but there are a certain number of elements. One is looking at previous shocks, previous crises. If we go back to 2008 and we look at investment behavior post-crisis, we see that capital was slow to come back, especially on the FDI side. We saw an acceleration in portfolio investment, especially after 2014, coming back to the region, but we saw slower recovery compared to other emerging economies when it comes to FDIs. And I think this is an important takeaway for this time that should give an additional incentive for governments to accelerate some of their structural reforms to attract investment. And the way to do it is to change some of their regulatory and legal framework to allow easier access to their markets by also opening up some of the sectors that are not very competitive, and also by improving the quality of infrastructure in terms of technology, access to finance, as well as also access to basic services. This is key because FDI is an important factor in job creation worldwide and in the region in particular. The second important takeaway is from the current crisis. We saw countries very rapid in repositioning themselves. We saw, for example, Morocco very active in redirecting their factories to produce some of the goods that were needed in the neighboring Europe in order to help address some of the supply chain shortages that we saw in the beginning. We see this also in other parts of the region in terms of producing ventilators, etc. We saw many excellent examples in that. And I think going forward, the way to do it is to avoid the shortages in terms of access to finance that could impact especially SMEs by being proactive in reducing the level of informality, especially at the small company side, and also by tying up economic relations, moving from economic cooperation to economic partnership. And this applies within the region and outside the region. Within the region, I think it's very important now with technology being the main driver for growth is to move from, I would say, geographically located markets to something that is much more open, that allow technology to have its full potential. Strengthening the partnership with neighboring countries, for example, for the North African countries with Sub-Saharan Africa, we saw successes here with what Moroccan's financial sector did, etc. We see a strong potential between the region and Asia because the recovery in Asia is stronger. and therefore demand will grow there. We see also a strong potential between Europe and also the region. Therefore, I think that rethinking the partnerships and moving into a new model of economic cooperation will also be an additional booster and will limit the risk of being inward-looking or privileging the local market and creating some artificial barriers that will really not help in the recovery.
Okay, thank you. I will take a few questions. We now have 6, so that's great. Let me start with some on the economy, and then there are some which are more geopolitical ones. So I'll take a batch of 3 and then another batch of 3. I would be grateful, Dr. Azour, if you could try and be brief in your response to each of these questions, because they cover a lot of topics. The first question from Milud Bukenumne is specifically about African oil-producing countries and what is generally the effect of the pandemic on them, whether we have something more specific to say about that. Then there is a question, I think, about infrastructure and basically the lack of Wi-Fi networks in some of these areas to allow for effective work, and what can be done, I suspect, in the short term to deal with the situation. They're bringing up the issue of the academic field in Nepal. This is Durga Prasad Jaishi. And then a final question on the economy is on monetary policy. This is from Lorenzo Enrighi, and what monetary policy should be pursued and what room of maneuver for unconventional monetary stimulus there are.
Thank you very much. On the first question, on Mulud's question, I think commodity producers worldwide have been affected by the crisis, including in North Africa, Algeria, Libya, are heavily affected by the drop in oil price. Those who are on some of maybe metals are in better shape, those who produce gold or other type of commodities. But it's clear, I think, what this crisis is showing us, that the risk of being pro-cyclical has materialized and provided once again the limitation of this boom and bust approach. And I think this is another opportunity for countries, now that interest rates are low and access to market became available, is to accelerate the transformation. Accelerating the transformation is gradually, both on the fiscal side but also on the economic side in terms of job creation, de-link the commodity sector from economic management. The question asked by Prasad on infrastructure, I think it's a critical one, because if I compare the region to other parts of the world, working remotely has been an issue because of the capacity that exists, both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of work organization. And failing to address this, we, in a new global economy where working remotely, where using technology is going to be critical, would create a risk of decoupling. And this risk of decoupling is between countries, but also within countries. Access to education is also a risk that could materialize if we don't invest in infrastructure, and also if we don't provide additional support to low-income people in allowing them to access through technology education. It also applies for workers, because some of the sectors will need time to recover, and some of them will be impacted for a long period. And therefore, we need to reskill labor. And technology here also is very important. Therefore, this is one priority with healthcare. I would say if there are two priorities, is invest in healthcare to protect lives and invest in technology in order to provide the needed infrastructure going forward. The third question, Lauren's question on monetary policy, I would say here the situation is different. We saw countries in the region, those who have flexible exchange rate regime using it, and it proved to be one important element to amortize and limit the impact of the shock. And greater flexibility is welcome in this case. Using monetary policy as a way, as a quasi-fiscal way to stimulate the economy, yes, it has been done and proved to be useful, but I think here we have to be very careful in order not to create new types of issues, not to have non-performing loans going up, and therefore banks need to be very cautious on how to provide liquidity. Second is the liquidity well targeted? And during the annual meetings last week, we had a lot of discussions with governors of central bank, and this is one of the issues that came. Yes, we provided financial liquidity, but we were not sure in the beginning that we are, in fact, providing it to those who need it. I think we have now 6 months or 7 months of experience. It's important to pause and reflect on that. Last but not the least, this crisis could have an impact, and we did a stress testing that we published it in our report, that if you stress test and simplify stress tests, the balance sheets of banks, we could lose 5% of GDP because of the crisis. And therefore, it's very important to benefit from the fact that banks are well capitalized, liquid, in order to have the right support, but not putting the financial stability at risk. Fernandino, back to you.
Yeah, I will stick a little bit more. There are 3 more questions on the economy, and then we can move to geopolitics. One is about the informal economy and the impact of the pandemic on the informal economy in North Africa and the Sahel region, from Pierluigi Signor, especially with regard to trafficking medicines. Then there is a question on global value chains, and this is from Hamed Azirar from Morocco, and he's concerned that global value chains may move as a result of the pandemic, I suspect, especially automotive, pharmacy, and textiles. And then there was a final question, yes, once again on oil exports, basically whether or not the IMF can prioritize loans to those countries that pursue strengthening of diversification away from oil. And this is from Kasumi Nishigaya, who's working at the UN mission in South Sudan.
Okay, on the first question, I think informality was one of the also issues that this crisis revealed as a key weakness. The fact that we have high level of informality limited the capacity to provide social and economic support to those who are not part of the formal sector. Countries tried to address this, for example, Morocco, by using mobile phones. They were able to access 5 million of those, but it's still one of the key issues. I would say there are 3 I's that we need to address going forward. One is informality, second is inclusion, and the third is inequality, and they come together in many cases. Informality is an important issue that needs to be addressed not only, I would say, not from a fiscal standpoint, but also from, and mainly from an economic and job creation and protection standpoint. Inclusion. Youth and women are the most vulnerable groups in that, and this crisis also showed that they are the most to be affected, but also they are the future of the region. If you improve the level of women participation and reduce the gap that exists with other emerging economies, you could create in 10 years $1 trillion of output. 3, the inclusion of youth. You have here highly educated, tech-savvy young generation that constitutes 60% of the population. and they can accelerate the recovery if they are given the opportunity, and therefore providing opportunity to those is going to be very important. And last I is the inequality. This is an issue we don't have in the region. A high level of poverty is but this inequality could widen with the future because of those who have access and those who don't have access, and therefore policies need to be geared toward reducing inequality. And this can be done by improving quality of infrastructure and services, but also through reforming the tax system to make it more progressive. On Ahmed's question on the global value chain, of course, we will be in a globalization 2.0. It's a postmodern globalization that we are seeing, that we don't know yet how this globalization is going to be. Of course, we are in a situation where several trends are occurring. The way of doing business is going to change. The way we are going to even produce, and the energy intensity in the production, not only in the production itself, but also in other elements like transportation, will matter in the future. And therefore, this is the right time to accelerate transformation. Accelerating transformation is by improving the quality of the enablers. Education is key. Technology as an infrastructure is another one. Improving the governance and fighting corruption is the third one. Improving the quality of laws, predictabilities of the regulation is also an important one. Those are not new, but I think those are now more relevant than ever. And it's an opportunity now to accelerate the transformation. I can go long and long on that, but I think those are at least important things. Last question, Kasumi question. The fund has provided this year a huge level of financial support to the region. We increased our lending by $15 billion, and we provided support to countries who were facing the COVID-19 in terms of rapid financial facilities, but also in terms of grants, like Yemen, like Sudan, like Djibouti, like Mauritania. But also we helped countries like Somalia deal with the long-lasting problem of debt, and then we were able to address this issue successfully in April. The fund can provide financing to countries who have balance of payment needs, countries even in the oil sector, oil-producing sector, but who don't have balance of payment needs, don't need our funding. They need, of course, our technical support and our policy reforms. But countries, even if they are in oil-producing and have needs in terms of balance of payment, we are ready to help. And I would say what is important in the fund's involvement, it provides framework for other institutions to come, like multilateral institutions or regional institutions. And I think this is where our role and our cooperation with other MDBs and IFIs has accelerated this year. And in several countries, we joined forces, and it helped provide tremendous support, like in the case, for example, of Egypt or Jordan. The fact that we provided support to Egypt and Jordan, it helped them mobilize additional $5 billion from other institutions, let alone the funding they got from the market.
Okay, I'll take a final batch of questions. I'm sorry for those who won't be allowed to ask one, but we are getting close to 4 p.m. So these are more broader geopolitical questions. So we could stay here for hours and hours to discuss them, but I would urge Mr. Azour just to try and finish by 4 p.m. First one from Fabio Graziano is over the role of China in the region. What will be it? And I suspect how it's changed over the last few months. Other question from Milud Bukenume is over the effect of the pandemic on international relations, North-South. So I suspect that could be tied into the previous question as well. And then there is a question of risks to social stability. This is from Fatima Mertad from Italy. The impact of the current crisis on the social situation. And then the final question, two final questions on Lebanon, which one is from Maria Mihaela Barbiero, is on whether there's going to be more assistance coming from Europe and France in particular, but also whether other countries will join efforts from France, which has taken a leading role, as we know. And then the final question, again on Lebanon, is about the IMF. How far is Lebanon from another default, and how the talks with the IMF are going. I know this is a lot, but I would urge you to stay in 5-6 minutes so that we can then conclude our session. And thank you all very much for your questions. Thank you, the public.
Well, first one, China is an important economic partner to the region, in particular to the oil exporting countries. One of the main export destinations of oil and gas is to China. But also China has a very strong relationship with other countries that have been financing some of the infrastructure projects, like in Morocco, Djibouti, a lot of investment there, and Mauritania and other countries in the region. And I would suspect that this relationship in the future will strengthen because China is getting out of this crisis faster than others. And strategically, China is repositioning itself into the global markets. Therefore, I would see the role of China growing in the future. The Milut's question on international relations, of course, the risks of inward looking, the risks of setting up barriers is an issue that could affect the region. And I would urge the region and also outside not to go into this road, because it proved in the past to be a road that doesn't produce any additional economic benefits. Risk to social stability, I think this is an important issue. We started seeing an increase in risk of social unrest prior to the COVID-19 shock. We have introduced back in 2017 an index on social unrest, and this index was showing a buildup in several countries that erupted in different places in the world, but also in the region. And yes, this crisis could exacerbate that, and I think it's very important to address. And any recovery has to be social in nature, otherwise we will face a lot of challenges. Lebanon, on the first question and the second question that are related to each other. I think there is commitment and interest by the international community to help Lebanon. France is leading the charge, but I think everybody is now waiting for Lebanon to come up with a reform plan that is comprehensive, that is credible, that will provide, bring confidence back and addresses the imbalances that exist in the system, addresses also the losses that have been incurred in the financial sector, and also addresses the impact of the explosion of last August that has affected the heart of the country and the heart of the city. The fund has expressed readiness to help if there is a homegrown, comprehensive and credible reform package that Lebanon will propose to the fund.
Okay, I think we can end here. Thank you very much, Dr. Azour, for this wide-ranging tour d'horizon of a very large but yet extremely fascinating region. Thank you to the Med Secretariat for organizing this event. Thank you for ISPI in particular for playing a crucial role in organizing Med. And thank you to all of you for listening in and for asking your questions. And I hope you've enjoyed the seminar as much as I did. So thank you and goodbye from me.
Thank you very much. And I would like also to add my voice to Fernandino's voice in thanking ISPI and Forum 2020. It was a great pleasure to be with you today. I very much liked the questions and the issues raised. I would encourage you to look at our report that has been published on the outlook for the region, in addition to 2 other papers that will be coming soon, one on governance and fighting corruption, and the other one is on social and social spending, very relevant topics to the region, in addition to something that we published back in January on the long-term sustainability of oil and the oil economies. Those are relevant to the discussion we had today. Again, thank you for having me, and it was a great pleasure.